Good morning, everyone. Be welcome to this talk. I'm Professor Cristiane, and together with Professor William and Professor Simone Rashigut, that couldn't be here today, we welcome Professor Lynn Mário, who kindly accepted our invitation not to deliver a lecture, but to share conversation about a theme we've been discussing in the subject topics in applied linguistics, decoloniality and language teaching. And well, although no presentations are needed for Professor Lynn, I will follow the protocol and make a brief presentation of him, okay? So, Professor Lynn Mário Trindade Menezes de Souza has a Bachelor of Arts in Linguistics from the University of Reading, MA in Applied Linguistics from the Catholic University of São Paulo, a PhD in Communication Studies and Semiotics from the Catholic University of São Paulo, and Livre Docência from the University of São Paulo. He's a professor of English in the Modern Language Department of the University of São Paulo, and he has been a visiting professor at some universities. So the University of Western Ontario, Monash, Oulu, Goa, and the University of the Western Cape. He has experience in research, teaching, and publications in language studies, focusing on the areas of critical pedagogy, literacies, critical literacy, applied linguistics, decolonial and postcolonial theory, and teacher education. Well, Professor Lynn, we thank you very much for being here, for sharing your knowledge and reflections with us. It is such an honor for us and for PPGL to have you here. And I'm sure we're going to have a very rich and fruitful conversation this morning. And before giving you the floor, I'd like William to say some few words about our subject so people can understand why we're here and the reason we're having this conversation this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mário. Good morning, everyone. I don't think we could have anyone more entitled to participate in this conversation than Professor Lynn Mário, whom I have known for a number of decades, possibly. And I've always thought of Lynn Mário as one of the most decolonial thinkers in the Brazilian academia and worldwide, even before knowing the meaning of decoloniality, even decoloniality studies caught on. Lynn Mário was there, always carrying out research from a decolonial perspective. And for our subject, decoloniality and language teaching, I think Lynn Mário is also able to draw important connections between decoloniality theories and specific aspects of language teaching, such as teacher education, teaching materials, or developing teaching materials which could be used for decolonial purposes, certain epistemologies, also drawing on the theories of Boaventura de Souza Santos and Walter Mignolo, whom we have been talking about for the past few weeks. And speaking of those theories, that saying in Portuguese actually comes from the Bible. Tell me who you hang out with, and I'll tell you who you are. It's interesting to note that Lynn Mário's friends with Boaventura de Souza Santos and Alistair Pennycook and Walter Mignolo and Fairclough and Brian Street and Homi Baba, all the theories we've been reading and talking about. I think Lynn Mário can contribute to this discussion with a very personal accounts of those theories too. So, without further ado, welcome Lynn Mário. And I'd like you all to feel free to contribute with any questions about decoloniality and language teaching. Since Mário kindly agreed not to do a formal presentation, but to base this talk on questions and answers. So feel free to ask any questions, write any questions on the chat, on our YouTube chat. And if that's all right with you, I'd like to begin with one question about some of the things we've been reading. May I, Chris? Okay. Last week, for example, we had been we've been reading one of Lynn Mário's paper called "Global Languages and Decoloniality from Below." And one of the interesting things that Lynn Mário mentions in this paper is that recently we have been able to decolonialize the concept of language. The way we think about language has changed. We can think of language these days in terms of translingual practices rather than a monolithic, monolingual set of rules or norms. However, in the same paper, Lynn Mário contends that maybe that's not enough. It's not enough to change our concepts of language without questioning, for example, what he terms our meta-discursive regimes. So, Lynn, I'd like you to comment on that contention. I mean, first, have we really changed, or has our concept of language really changed? After all these years, what else needs to be changed so that our decolonial theories could be implemented in language teaching?
Okay, William, thank you very much. First, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Well, I am in your space, so I already feel welcome here. So let's go on with this. Yeah, before we can change our concepts of language, I think we have to change other things. We have to change how we listen and how we think, because otherwise, what we get is just changing ideas or what we call changing epistemologies, which is a word which has become fashionable in the last few years. But the whole point of decolonial thinking is not just changing knowledge or theories or epistemologies. It's changing these theories and these knowledges as they are thought from different bodies. And the important thing here is we think from our bodies. See, and what in my work, what I try to point out is that in decolonial thinking, we have to bring the body back into our thinking, right? Because what comes before decolonial theories is what we call coloniality, theories of which we've inherited from colonization. And as you know, colonization, even though technically it may have ended, technically in Brazil we have been independent since 1822, but virgula, right? We haven't, right? We still continue under the influence of colonization from the global north, right? We still feel our knowledges are still, the knowledges we produce in Brazil within our languages, Portuguese or Libras or indigenous languages in Brazil, these knowledges are still considered to be inferior to knowledges produced in the global north and in languages which are considered to be universal, right? Like English, for example, right? How universal is English? It's not a universal language. It's a language which has owners who call themselves native speakers, who feel they can make decisions about the language and oblige us to follow these rules, right? these owners of English also feel authorized to give us certificates just so that we can say they can decide if we are proficient or not and how proficient we are to speak their language. So what I'm saying here is that there is no language which is everybody's language. Unfortunately, we live under this myth of English as being the universal language. Here in Brazil, we are talking about what we call the internationalization of our universities. So we feel many of our universities oblige us to do courses in English in our own universities, and to have we're obliged when we do our postgraduate courses, mestrado, doutorado, we are obliged to do a language test in English and then in one more foreign language. How many people in the global north, in Europe, North America, US, Canada, how many people there know another language apart from English, right? Even in places like Canada, which is also in North America, they supposedly they're a bilingual country. They have French and English as their official languages, but most Canadians don't speak French. Only the people in Quebec, where French is the official language in that province, practically only they are the ones who speak French, and they are obliged also to learn English. But apart from this, people only speak one language. So this is just an example of how knowledge is not free. Knowledge is not simply learning to know. Knowledge comes with power. Knowledge comes with all kinds of what we call gatekeeping, meaning there are people who feel they own this knowledge and they can say how much of this knowledge should be learned, and they decide, right? So these are all examples, like the ownership of language, the ownership of knowledge. These are examples of what we call coloniality. So what decolonial thinking does is it tries to change this situation, right? Because obviously the majority of the planet is not the global north. The majority of the population of the planet is already in one place or two places like India and China, right? So why are we continuing to live under this dominance, this political, it's not political dominance, it's economic dominance, and it's more important than the economic dominance because this is how it affects us. We may feel we are not rich, we are not in business, so we're not interested in the economics of the planet, but it affects us. It affects us how we learn in our classrooms, how we teach in our classrooms, because it tells us what languages our knowledge, the knowledge that gets to us, what languages this knowledge comes in, and it tells us how we have to relate to this knowledge and what languages we need to use. So yes, this situation needs to be changed. And the first step to changing this situation is to challenge these languages and these knowledges that we get from the global north, which we inherit through colonization. These people are not colonizers anymore officially because official colonization ended, but they continue to dominate the world economically. So colonization has only ended officially, as I said, but its effects continue, and we call this coloniality. Now, how did coloniality work? How does it work? Especially in terms of language and knowledge. It works through, the first thing it works through is universalization. These people, as I mentioned already about English, they give us the impression that their language is the language of the world. English, for example. They give us the impression that the knowledges they produce are the knowledges of the world. Now, how is this impression produced, and how does it generate these effects which are so effective that we believe in them, right? Well, it's simple. As I mentioned, it's universalization. They produce knowledge as if it's universal. What does universal mean? That this knowledge has been produced by everybody for everybody. That this knowledge is equally valid for everybody anywhere on the planet. The example of this is what we call science, right? So when we use the word science, we don't put an adjective before science. We don't say British science or North American science, French science, German science. We say science, right? Now, if you go and in your own bairro to do acupuncture, for example, how many of you have done acupuncture? If you haven't, then you know someone who has here in Brazil. Now, if you go to do, or if you know someone who does acupuncture, what is acupuncture? It's science. It's a different kind of science. It's medicine. It's a different kind of medicine. It's not the medicine included in what the North Americans or the Europeans call medicine. It's a different science, and it will be called, Asian science, or a local science, but it won't be called science. Yeah? Here in Brazil, as we inherit colonial thinking, we don't consider acupuncture to be scientific. We'll do it just like we do macumba, whatever that is, right? Because we're afraid if we don't do it, maybe we're going to get hurt by it, so we better do it, right? But what I'm saying here is that there are different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of science, not to mention African sciences. They have a large number of scientific knowledges in Africa, in the plural, right? But why is it that only the global north produces scientific knowledge which is being called science, as if it's the only form of science and as if it's equally valid anywhere on the planet, right? It isn't. Science isn't equally valid anywhere. Science doesn't know everything. We have been given evidence of this in the last 2.5 years with COVID. If science knew everything, why did we have to lock ourselves in our homes for 2 years, right? So what does this tell us? Scientific knowledge is knowledge that learns from experience, right? So now we know more about COVID than we did 2.5 years ago, when so many people here in our country died, right? Now, I had COVID last month, right? I'm here talking to you, right? Probably if I had COVID 2.5 years ago, before I had the vaccinations, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you, right? So our knowledge, we learn from our experience, from our living experience, the feedback we get from from how we live. And this is how knowledge works. This is how science works, right? So science is not something that comes top down from people who know everything. They are learning as they go along. And so the sciences of everywhere on the planet work like this as well. Acupuncture, for example, is a science which is thousands of years old. It comes from thousands of years of observation. Let's imagine, in a very primitive, basic sense, that someone thousands of years ago discovered that if they stick a pin in your body somewhere, it has an effect. Then they began observing that, and then that observation passed on to another generation. And then they got evidence that, yes, maybe this is how it works. It has an effect, right? But because you can't see the connections between, it's not like you can cut your body open and see where the blood flows from the heart to the tip of the finger. In acupuncture, it's a different kind of knowledge. You have to learn that the energy that constitutes your body is not visible. It is there. You have to use different instruments to see it. For example, a pendulum, right? A pendulum if you use a pendulum and you follow different points on your body, you can identify the path of a negative flow of energy when the pendulum will move anti-clockwise, or a positive flow of energy when the pendulum will move clockwise. So then you can see you're not imagining things. It's there. But science will not accept, European, North American science will not accept a pendulum as a scientific instrument. They will not accept that what they can't see exists, right? But then that's their way of thinking, that's their knowledge, right? In the same way as some people have spiritual, religious beliefs that there is someone, a divinity, and that divinity looks in a particular space, is in a particular body. That divinity may be male or white or black or have an elephant's head, right? But they believe in that divinity and they're willing to kill for that divinity, right? This is how culture works. So science, what we call science, is also a cultural phenomenon, right? So why am I talking about science and acupuncture and culture? To say that language works in the same way. When we develop a concept of language in linguistics or applied linguistics, right, which we then presuppose because we begin to learn how to teach this language, and then we talk about pedagogy and methodology. But let's go back a little bit and think about language itself. Right? Like acupuncture, our concept of language develops after observation, right? After learning about the learning that we get from reflecting on language. And the reflection that we do is always based on our cultural background, who we are, what we already know before we can begin to reflect. So we don't reflect without a body. When we talk about culture, we're talking about space, a place where our culture exists and circulates, right? When we talk about culture, we are talking about history. The culture we have today, right, comes from the thinking of the people who preceded us in the same place where we are now. So culture and science require a body. They require that we remember that we're always thinking from a body. And why is it important to remember that we're thinking from a body? Because our body is always located in a space, and the space where our body is located is a space which has a particular history. So this space that I'm occupying now, in my body, I have a particular history. So here I'm speaking to you from São Paulo. São Paulo has a particular history, not only as São Paulo, but also as Brazil, as Latin America, as historical space, geographical space in the world. And at the moment here, I'm speaking to you from São Paulo, but I'm speaking to you also from the same body. I'm speaking to you as a professor of language. So I have been exposed to bibliographies which I have read in order to say what I'm saying to you. Right? So these bibliographies, I've been exposed to courses, so I've been exposed to knowledges which have influenced me and provoked my reflection. And the conclusion of my reflection is what I'm saying to you now. So what I'm saying is that in the same space that my body occupies, I'm influenced not just by history, but I'm influenced by all the discourses, the knowledges to which have influenced me in this space. In my case, as an academic, the libraries I have read, the books I have read. Now, what's important here is who has written the books that I have read. And in our case, in language, it's important to go back and think about the bodies of the people who have written about language. So what I'm saying is, in my thinking, I say one of the important things in decolonial thinking is to bring the body back. Because when we bring the body back, we're not talking simply about discourse. Discourse is this idea that language is always organized socially, right? Language is not random. We don't say what we want. We just can't invent words and put them together and they will have meaning. No, we have to follow the rules of the ways that people make meaning before us. And then we can reorganize words in certain creative ways, but we can't change the ways that words are organized totally. Right? So as Paulo Freire reminds us when he says that before, and I'll say this in Portuguese first, antes de ser o eu de mim mesmo, eu fui o você de outro. So before I became the I of myself, I am speaking now. Before I became this I was somebody else's you. Meaning what? Meaning that the way that I learned to speak and to think comes from the people who I was exposed to before me. It may have been my family, if we are privileged enough to have a family. It may have been just my mother, right? May have been simply the people who took care of me. And in my case, as an academic, it's the people who taught me, the people who wrote the books that I read. Right? So when we are thinking about language, what does this all mean? How does it affect us when we're talking about language? What is important to know is, where did we get the concepts of language that we use now from? Where did they come from? And in linguistics, whether we like it or not, we are linguists, right? Even when we're working with language teaching, we're linguists because we're using concepts of language which in many cases were developed by the linguists. Remember, we do things the linguists don't do. We teach language. Linguists don't teach language, and they don't think about the complexities of language teaching. That's where we as applied linguistics linguists come in. But if we look at the origin of our concepts of language in modern linguistics today, you'll find two names that come up a lot. First, Saussure, and secondly, Chomsky, right? Now, let's forget about Chomsky because there are other linguists who came up after Chomsky, which were probably equally important, but many of them were not linguists. For example, Foucault, who was not a linguist, Bakhtin, who was not a linguist, they also thought about language, but their names aren't as publicly famous as Chomsky. But someone who is famous to all linguists is Saussure. Saussure is the guy who told us that there are two ways of looking at language. He didn't tell us what language is. He told us there are two ways of looking at language or thinking about language. One way is to look around us and see how language is used. And this he called fala. Okay, in Portuguese we translate it as fala, or in French he called it, what did he call it in French? Parole. In French he called it parole, which can be translated as fala, right? Or in English as performance. This is the way people use language. And if you look around, we'll see people using language differently. People speak with different accents. People speak, when they speak informally, or if they're giving a lecture like I'm doing now, which I said I wouldn't be doing, right? We are speaking formally. So people, when they are using language around us, they may be using language formally or informally. They may be speaking or writing. They may have certain accents. Some will have an accent, a certain accent. Others will have other accents, right? These accents may be geographical, from different spaces. They may be social accents, where we can identify the social class of the person who is speaking, right? They may be professional ways of speaking. for example, lawyers and doctors speak in one way, right? Teachers speak in another way. Teachers ask questions all the time, right? So if we look around us and how people are using language, according to Saussure, what we see is this confusion, this complexity of variability, of different uses. Chaos, absolute chaos, a confusion. Now remember, Saussure was thinking at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. So, right, 130, 140 years ago, where at the time what Saussure wanted was, he wanted to think about language in scientific terms. Because previously, people who had thought about language anywhere on the planet, in Asia, in Africa, or in Europe, people thought about language in historical terms. People who were reflecting on language were generally philosophers who were trying to discover, where did language come from? What is language? How did the people in the past think about language, right? So this we call philology. So people were accustomed to think about language in historical terms, but not like philosophy. We sit down and we think, but we are not observing. We are not putting things in a laboratory. We are not writing rules of behavior of language. We are not making descriptions of language. So Saussure wanted to develop language into a science, because this is what was happening at the end of the 19th century. Philosophies such as positivism and rationality were important. So to make language into a science, he had to use the philosophies, the ways of thinking that other sciences were using. Remember, Darwin had used rationality and science. So what is rationality? Rationality says that everything follows a logic, a chronological logic, one thing comes before another, and a causal logic, one thing causes another. So when we observe something, we think, this is an effect. What caused this effect? And then science will try to identify the cause of a certain effect. We can look at it from a religious perspective as well. We can say, here we have a cause, as, for example, shamanic medicine, what the indigenous cultures do. Here we have a cause, something caused it. There's something which caused it, maybe in the spirit domain. This is what caused this particular effect. But science will say, no, this is, we can observe the causes. Okay, this is positivistic. Positive because it believes that things exist. They are not absent. They are positively present. Rational because they believe there is a logic of cause and consequence. Darwin developed his ideas of survival and the capacity of the species to survive, because the strongest, the fittest, that were the ones that survived evolution. Now we can prove his theory wrong. But at the time, he believed that the species that survived at the time that he was observing them were species that must have been strong enough to survive millions of years of evolution or exposure to the environment and to the elements. Okay, so science uses rationality and science uses positivism. So Saussure decided to think about language as a science using these two elements. Now, if he looked around him and saw this confusion and chaos, different accents, different forms of language, dialects, informal language, formal language, written, spoken, even within written language, we can have literary language, journalistic language. He didn't have people using texting at the time, but you can imagine how this profusion of different forms of languages. Saussure concluded, no, I can't think language as a science. I can't think language as positivism and rationalism demand, by looking at the use of language. It's too complex. Language doesn't, as we can say, language doesn't stay still and say cheese in order for you to take a photograph. Language is dynamic. It's changing all the time, right? So what did he decide? He made a very conscious decision. He said, let me look at language as an abstract system. So I will look at all of this extreme chaos and variability of language. And beneath this variability, or what is common to all of this variability, will be certain rules. These are the rules of grammar or syntax, as you call them. In pronunciation, we may have all of these different forms of pronouncing language, but then we will also have rules of what he called phonemes, right? So we can organize this chaos. We can reduce this chaos to particular rules. And this is how he developed language, which he said he made a distinction between lingua and fala. Fala is this confusion. Lingua is this abstract system from which we can define a grammar, right? And this will be how we consider language. And this, until today, more than a century after Saussure, we don't question Saussure. We still do what Saussure says, right? So we have an abstract system, which is a grammar. And then the variation is not important, because what we need to know is the abstract system. Now, this affects us hugely. It generates all kinds of social and political consequences for us as teachers of language. What does it mean? It means that let's talk about the mother tongue teaching, Portuguese here in Brazil rather than English for the moment. So what it says is that if we don't reflect critically on this concept of language as abstract system, then what do we see in the classrooms of the initial years of primary education in Brazil? We'll see in the majority of Brazil. I'm not talking about, let's forget about the privileged schools of the rich areas. Let's think about the great majority of Brazilians, those many of whom have parents who didn't complete their schooling. What kind of Portuguese do these children speak? Now, when these children go into a classroom, especially into even before the subjects are divided in disciplines, they will very often hear the teacher say, "Fale direito, menino, isso aí não é português." And that child thinks, put yourself in the body of that child. That child thinks, como assim fala direito? I'm speaking like my mother speaks. I'm speaking like the people in my bairro speak, right? I'm speaking like everybody else speaks. What does it mean, fala direito? And then when they teach me to write, they teach me to write in a way that I don't even speak. Right? Como assim? Right? And imagine the confusion in the head of this child. Now, what is the political, social consequence of this idea of language as an abstract system? These kids will feel excluded. They feel they don't belong in a school. The school is teaching them things which are not related to their bairro, their street, their family. First, the school is teaching them they don't exist. They don't speak anything. The school is disrespecting them. They begin to develop a dislike, a hate for the school. The knowledges of the school are not relevant. They're not connected to how I live in my street, in my bairro, in my family. Right? Now, these kind of consequences of excluding a large part of the population from the school system, I'm suggesting they're a problem, right? Because they're not helping a large proportion of the country. Now, if you think from a different political perspective, this may be an advantage. It means these people will not think These people will not participate in politics. These people will not read newspapers. These people can be manipulated politically. I want this situation, right? So what I'm trying to show you here is the different consequences that a concept of language can have. So what we need urgently is to go back and look at this concept of language, which we as language teachers are using without thinking, as if it's natural, right? And decolonial theory says, let's go back and put a body to the people that produce these knowledges of language and see what we can see from their bodies. Okay, so what can we see from Saussure? Ferdinand de Saussure, who produced this concept of language as being an abstract system. Now, he didn't reject the concept that language is chaotic, language is a confusion, language is use. He knew language was use, but he preferred to concentrate on language as abstract system. Now, many of us as linguists and language teachers, we forget that Saussure told us that language exists as chaos. But he preferred to focus on language as an abstract system. He didn't say language didn't exist as use and as chaos. So we forget, we focus so much on Saussure's thinking on language as a system that we forget that he did speak of language as chaos. Right? Okay, so Saussure spoke of language as an abstract system. But once we give a body to Saussure, let's give a body to Saussure. Saussure didn't only have a name, he had a body. Let me try to describe his body. He was white, he was European, and he was Swiss, right? From Switzerland, from Geneva. Now, what do we know about all of these things, about being white, about being male, and about being Swiss? I don't even know about his sexuality, otherwise I would have commented here, but let's presuppose he was even heterosexual, right? I don't know. But all of these things which are hidden when we don't take into account Saussure's bodies, they affect us now, 100 and something years later, and how we teach our students in our classroom. Let me tell you how. Because Saussure, by being Swiss, European, and male, writing and thinking at the end of the 19th century, what did we have? What was the world situation at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century? At that time, Britain, the United Kingdom, and France controlled, as colonial authorities, let's say 3/4 of the globe. I haven't done this 3/4, I'm speaking in general terms, right? They dominated economically and politically the globe. Now, it wasn't European, French and British men who were dominating the globe. It wasn't the women who were dominating, it was men. So the people who were dominating the globe were masculine, they were white, and they were from Europe. Why is this important? Okay, let me tell you why. Because the way people use language in Europe is different to the way people use language, for example, in Asia, in Africa. Or if we look at Latin America outside our European centers like Sao Paulo, we go to the Amazon. So how do people use language in Europe? They use language monolingually. People in Europe speak only one language. In England, they only speak English. In France, they only speak French. But you will say, but Saussure was Swiss. In Switzerland, they speak 3 or 4 languages. They have French, they have German, they have Italian, and they have a language called Romansh. So Switzerland And you can say to me, Lynn, Mário, Switzerland is multilingual. No. Switzerland is not multilingual, because in the one part of Switzerland, they only speak French. In another part of Switzerland, they only speak German. In another part of Switzerland, they only speak Italian, and so on. So Switzerland is a federation of monolingual spaces. So what's important is that in Europe, there is a connection between language and space, language and territory. So if we know where the person comes from, the space that the person comes from, we can identify the person's language. If you come from England, you speak English. If you come from France, you speak French. And the same logic will apply to Switzerland. If you come from French Switzerland, you speak French. From German Switzerland, you speak German. Where did Saussure come from? He came from Geneva, French Switzerland. So Saussure spoke French. So he was, what I'm saying here is, he was monolingual. So what is this? How is this important? Now, poor Saussure must be turning in his grave. But it is important. I'm not just trying to resuscitate the body of Saussure to trouble him. I'm trying to trouble our way of thinking of language. Saussure was monolingual. The way that a monolingual person, a person who speaks only one language, the way that this person thinks about language is different to the way that people who speak more than one language think about language. Okay, the first thing is, people who speak only one language don't think about language, right? Because they think they can't separate themselves from a language. They don't think about language unless they are Saussure, right? Or unless they are linguists. But people who speak about only one language think everybody speaks like me. They only think in terms of right or wrong. So people who speak only one language like to tell other people who are learning their language, that's right, that's wrong. You don't pronounce it like that, you pronounce it like this. They like to correct all the time because they have never thought about language. You only begin thinking about language when you are aware of the existence of more than one language, right? So people who speak more than one language, for example, from India, from Africa, our indigenous communities in Brazil, you know that many of our indigenous communities in Brazil, their wives, they marry women or men from different communities. So it's very common in our indigenous communities in Brazil for children to grow up with their mother speaking one language and their father speaking another. So multilingualism, speaking more than one language, is normal and natural for, let's say, more than half of the planet. But our thinking of language has been inherited and is reproduced from the perspective of the monolinguals, because at the time, this knowledge was produced in Europe, and Europe was the colonial authority. So all knowledge came from Europe, and we still continue to reproduce this knowledge. So we can look at language as a single abstract system if we are monolingual. If we think of language from a different body, for example, as an Indian or as an African, then what kind of my body, I'm thinking as a person who speaks many languages. My father speaks one language, my mother speaks another. In the street, people speak another language. When I go and buy and sell something, there's another language being spoken. So when, for someone who is thinking from a body of many languages, we don't have the concept of language as something with a name. My personal experience, I grew up with many languages. Right? My father spoke one language. My father spoke Portuguese. My mother spoke English. In the street, they spoke Arabic. my grandparents spoke another language, but no one ever told me or my brothers that languages have names. No one told us, now you speak this language, then you speak that language. As a child, we learned that with one parent, with the father, this is the way we spoke. With the mother, this is the way we spoke. This didn't have a name. There was no wall which separated one language from another, right? In the same way as we learn our mother tongues, when we are learning Portuguese in Brazil, we learn that to older people you speak in a particular way, to your friends you speak in another way, right? When you're texting on your cell phones, you're using a different kind of language. We learn this. We don't give names to these different languages. This is a multilingual perspective of language, which doesn't separate one language from another. This is a perception of chaos, the same as Saussure had when he thought there was only one language. But in fact, he knew that there are different forms of this one language. Right? Now we can bring that knowledge which Saussure preferred not to think and use it to think about different languages. So languages are not abstract systems. What I'm saying is that languages are this chaos of multiple forms which circulate together and which are interconnected, and there's no distinct separation. Now you're speaking one, now you're speaking another. Now, the way that if we are thinking from the perspective of multilingualism, we think. Because as I said, we know languages don't have names, but we know that, as my personal experience, I knew that with my father I had to modify my way of speaking. With my mother I had to modify my way of speaking. I had this knowledge. This knowledge linguists don't take into account. It's what I call linguistic knowledge, which is not a knowledge of language, but it's a knowledge about language. So decoloniality, what decoloniality is saying is that first, let's stop talking about the universalization of knowledge, of science, right, of language. Let's give bodies to the people who produce these knowledges. Once we give bodies, we can understand that all knowledge is local. It comes from specific spaces. This does not make all knowledge is equal, right? Because each locality has its own history, has its own influences, its own characteristics. So we can't just exchange one knowledge for another. But what it says is that one knowledge doesn't necessarily have greater value than another, right? When one knowledge is sold to us as being academic knowledge or science, then we have a history of power which promotes this knowledge as having more value than another. This is what happens to us here. We are all linguists in Brazil, but when we write about language in Brazil, it's very difficult for us to be published abroad. We are forced to write in English. And then the publishers, the international publishers, are not from Brazil, they are from the global north. Then they will say, but who is this Brazilian writing about language? Who will want to read a Brazilian writing about language? Right? Now, if we have an American or a white male global north person writing about language in Brazil, everybody will read it. This is how colonization works. So what we're doing in decoloniality is, and in my work I try to emphasize this, bring the body back, give the subject that produces knowledge a body, then we will see where they are speaking from, where they have produced their knowledge from, then we can begin to discuss their knowledge. In language, it's extremely important, because what we learn from people who produce knowledge about language from a multilingual perspective is very different to what we learn from people who produce knowledge about language from a monolingual perspective. From a monolingual perspective, where I said they don't think about language, they speak language. So they don't think about how difficult it is to learn. They don't think about how there are many forms of language. Right? They don't think about how it is normal to speak more than one language. They speak that language. Now, for us, coming back to our situation as teachers of foreign languages in Brazil, this is not relevant for us. We need to know our students already speak a language, they are learning another language. So we need to know about linguistic knowledge. We need to know about how do people feel when they are learning another language. How is it easy or difficult to learn another language? If our students don't reflect about language, their own language, they will probably have difficulty to learn another language. They probably think that to learn another language, they have to forget their own language. Or when they learn another language, they have to become equal to the people who speak that other language. How many Brazilians believe this? They believe that once they learn English, they become American. Now they can go to Miami and Disneyland and everything, and no one will notice, right? Or to speak another language, you have to lose your accent. Impossible, right? And an accent is not something negative, right? An accent is part of our identity. It's like having a carteira de identidade. It tells you who you are. An accent is something we should be proud of. Right? It may be difficult if people don't understand us, but then it's not our problem, it's their problem. And the important thing when we are not understood in language is we have to try to make ourselves understood. So the important thing is not our accent, it's trying to make ourselves understood. So what I'm saying here, from a decolonial perspective, let's think about language from where we are, from what I call our locus of enunciation. Let's stop thinking about language as something abstract, universal. Now, language is always connected to who we are, where we are speaking from, what is our history, what discourses exist in the space that we are learning and speaking from, because all of this will affect how we think about language and how we learn about language. I've spoken too much. Let me stop there. And if there are any questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Chris, I was going to read Marco's question.
Okay, I'll project it here, right?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so Marco said, you talked about the OSAMs and how English can be considered a local language. How different this discussion is when we consider BNCC. And then he adds, how can this official document help or not teachers who are trying to reframe their practice considering the colonial practices?
Okay, so, well, it depends on how we read the BNCC, because remember, official documents are not self-explanatory. It all depends on how we use them and how we read them, right? So I co-authored the OSAMs with my colleague Valkyria Montemor for English, right? But very few people read those. They were produced by Brasilia. How many teachers read those? You may be reading them because you are studying language, right? But if you're a teacher in the classroom, you probably will never read them. They were never accessible, right? So one thing first, let's talk about official documents, right? There's a general understanding that official documents are not to be read. Official documents are there to please politicians, right? But very rarely will a teacher have access to and read these official documents. Okay, so what I'm saying is that rather than what is written in the Sayings or BNCC, let's see how the BNCC is implemented, or how the Sayings are implemented. That's more important than what's in the documents. And as you know, in the whole process of producing the BNCC, there were differences between the original versions of the BNCC and the final versions of the BNCC. The BNCC, I don't agree with the general orientation of the BNCC. What the BNCC departs from a principle which I consider to be problematic, which is the idea of core knowledge. So what the BNCC tries to establish is that we have a core knowledge. I'm not sure. I think their proposal is about 30%, if I'm not mistaken, and the rest can be whatever percentage it is. There's an idea that we have a certain body of nuclear essential knowledge, and the rest can vary from one region to another, one geographical region to another, one school to another. Right? This is extremely problematic, because who decides what is core and what is not core? Who decides what is essential and what is not essential? In other words, who are making the decisions in the BNCC? People who are elected, and the people who made decisions of language in the BNCC were people who were indicated by neoliberal private interests, in people who were interested in privatizing education. Now, who are these people interested in privatizing education? They are people interested in making education elite. So the way they are reading the BNCC is to say that what is essential in education will be understood like that by the elite, and what the rest do with education is not really of interest. So the BNCC is an elitist proposal. Now, I'll give you I'll counterpose this with how the Sayings were written. The BNCC was written supposedly with a lot of public interaction. No, there wasn't. There was public debate, but to what extent the debate was incorporated into the BNCC, that's a different issue. It wasn't incorporated. Right? Now, to do the Orientações Curriculares, it took us 2 years to write this in between 2004 and 2006. Right? Now, during these 2 years, the process of writing was, we were sent to different places in the country, different regions no grande interior do Brasil, right? Where we are listening to teachers. We are talking to teachers, and they were telling us how difficult it was for them to teach, in our case, English as a foreign language, because they didn't have access to teaching materials. Many of them, and we saw in many realities of the country, and here I'm saying, using it in the plural, I'm using the word reality, meaning the context in which these people live, right? I'm not using reality to say that this is a concrete, unchanging situation, but in the different contexts that we encountered, it was very common for English language teachers to be substitute teachers. So these were teachers who weren't even trained in English. They knew a little bit about English, but they were probably teachers of Portuguese in general, or teachers of history, who, because they knew a little bit of English and there was no English teacher, they occupied the space of an English teacher. This was the reality that we encountered the most, right? So people who knew a little bit about English became English language teachers. Now, it was based on this reality that we wrote the orientações curriculares. Right? Because what we wanted to do with education is not to create an elite education and forget the rest. What we wanted to do was to say, if this is the reality of the majority of the country, where the teachers are not speakers of English or they don't have a proficient knowledge of English, but they are the English language teachers in these schools, what can they do? Let's stop crying and say, but there are substitute teachers, we have to change the situation. This won't work because English language teachers are not available in those regions, right? People who become proficient in English in the big cities, they don't want to go to the Cafundós do país to teach English. That won't work. It doesn't work with our medical doctors who don't want to leave the big cities. Why will it work with English? So let's stop thinking from top down. In an ideal situation, this is what should happen. So let's begin with the reality of the context of our country. So a teacher who doesn't know everything about the English language. But what's important about this person? This person is a teacher. This person is not a speaker of language, a speaker of English as a foreign language. This person is a teacher. What is a teacher? An educator. So how can this person continue to educate his or her students with the knowledge that they have? Then we have to see, this was our first question. The second question, what is important about learning a foreign language? Is it to learn a foreign language and be proficient in a foreign language? Or is it to learn about the existence of different forms of different languages? Is it to learn that different languages occur and exist in the world, and in each different language people think differently? For example, different languages organize time differently. Different languages talk about the present, the past, and the future in different ways, because different cultures organize time, think about time differently. So once we can talk about this with our students, we are educating our students that there is not only one way of thinking. There are different ways of thinking and being. Right? So we can educate our students about words, for example, not just about, I gave the example of verb tenses, time. Different words, different languages have different words for what we may think are the same things. But what does this tell us? For example, in Brazil, we have the word in Portuguese, mormaço. Right? How can we express this in another language? It's not possible to translate this into English, because this is, mormaço refers to something which we feel about our weather, our climate in Brazil. But unless you live in this weather and this climate, it doesn't make sense to use a word like mormaço. Right? So what's important in education about language is to educate, and here the word is educate learners on how people think differently about different things, how to appreciate difference. The world is not alike and everybody should be alike. The world consists of different people who think differently, who occupy different bodies, all right? But we're all the same in our difference. This is what the educational value of learning a foreign language is for me. It's not learning to speak a foreign language. Now, you can do that as well. You can also learn to speak a foreign language. But as I made a critique about monolinguals, right? They only speak language, they don't think about language. So a monolingual teacher of English as a foreign language is the worst teacher you can find, because this teacher will not explain the difficulty, because this teacher has not gone through the difficulty of learning another language. They will only be able to tell you what is correct and what is wrong. They cannot help you to think about language. They cannot facilitate your process of learning a language. So what I'm saying is that there is, when we're talking about Osains or Menezes, here we're talking about education. We're talking about the system, the school system. We're talking about language in a specific context of education. So what is the contribution of foreign languages to education? For me, this is the greatest contribution. Respect difference, right? And the respecting difference will have all kinds of repercussions. When we respect difference, we will be able to to resist racism, to resist gender phobia, homophobia, whatever phobia, right? So we can do all of this. We can educate our students to all of this through teaching a foreign language. We have this privilege in our space. But if we think that the space of teaching a foreign language is to learn a foreign language, we are losing all of these opportunities of education. You can learn a foreign language outside the school. You don't need a school to learn a foreign language. You can learn a foreign language in cada esquina, right? Now, if we're talking about educational documents, we're talking about education. We're not talking about language learning. So I forget a colleague's name who asked this question. So,
Marco. Marco.
Marco. So reread the BNCC and see what do they say about education in the space of foreign language teaching, and not about how to learn a foreign language. This is what we call educação linguística. Educação linguística is what we say a discipline. It is not a subject, right? A subject has content. So if we are talking about a foreign language as a subject, then in that subject called English, you're expected to learn English and nothing else. If we have a discipline, which is a body of knowledge, a discipline called foreign languages, right? Then that is where the objective is not to learn a foreign language. The objective is to reflect on what we can learn from foreign languages, from the existence of languages. We can learn about our own language when we reflect on foreign languages. So I make this distinction. So in the Osains, this is what we talk about, the importance of foreign languages as a discipline and not as a subject. The BNCC say it's not clear. It's not clear at all.
Yeah, well, we have the idea of this English as a lingua franca in BNCC that we don't really know what it means. Yeah. So at the same time, it seems to be contemplating variety, heterogeneity. It seems to reinforce English as a universal language.
Right. It doesn't question. Yeah, it doesn't question.
It doesn't question.
Yeah. English as a lingua franca can mean different things. It comes from a theory originally. First, a lingua franca is a situation in which the language we are speaking is not mine, it's not yours, but it's a language we will use for negotiation, right? This is what, in linguistic terms, a lingua franca means. So nowadays, in the last 10, 15 years, we have a huge body of theoretical knowledge, academic knowledge produced about lingua franca. But it's important to think where lingua franca comes from. It comes from European thinkers, Austrian, German, Scandinavian thinkers. They were saying, and they say this until today, if you go to places like Scandinavia or Germany or Sweden, or in general in Europe, but let's not generalize. You will, let's say Scandinavia, where my experience with Scandinavia. If you go to Sweden, you'll see people who learn English. People learn English as if it's their language. They are very fluent in English. In the street, you'll find people, you go into a shop, they'll speak English. They were not colonized by Britain. They don't even like the Americans or the British, right? But they learn, they're very fluent in English. Now they get very offended if an English person says to them, English is my language, not yours, right? They're learning English from a different perspective. They are not colonized by the English or the Americans. They don't want to become like the English or the Americans, right? They learn English as a way of communicating with other people in Europe. They learn English because they like pop music. They even produce songs in English, right? Remember ABBA, right? Which was a Swedish group that sung in English. So they have a different relationship to the English language to what the British have, or those who are in a colonial relationship have, right? So these thinkers began to think, all the thinking about teaching English comes from the British or the Americans. They assume that if you want to learn English, you have to be British or American. They have this idea that the native speaker is the best model of learning English as a foreign language. So these people began to question. They said, no, we are not using the native speaker model for learning and teaching English. So they developed this concept of English as a lingua franca, right? The Europeans were not British or Americans, right? So now this is very interesting, because originally what this concept said was that no one owns the English language. There are no native speakers of the English language. But then academically, what happened? Whenever you want to use this concept of lingua franca, now there are owners. You have to cite the knowledge produced by the Germans, the Austrians, the Scandinavians. And then my colleague, Anna Paula Duboc from USP, right? She begins to react, and from a decolonial perspective, and say, just a minute, we contribute, we recognize the notion of English as a lingua franca, but we don't want the reproduction of the coloniality of the notion. Now, in the BNCC, this discussion, Anna Paula Duboc wrote a document to dialogue with the proposals of the BNCC. It was not taken into account. So if you want to use lingua franca, lingua franca speaks from a decolonial perspective. Otherwise, lingua franca becomes simply another normative perspective. So the first thing about lingua franca is what happens when you teach people how to negotiate, and then it becomes a school subject. One of the things you have to do with a school subject is correct exams. So how can you say, if you're speaking of English as a lingua franca and the BNCC as a school subject, not as a discipline to reflect on language, to learn English as a lingua franca, then how can you tell your student when their knowledge is sufficient or not, when they are correct or not? To be correct or not, you have to use a normative conception of language. Lingua franca is not a normative conception of language. It's an attitude towards language. So I have problems with the concept of lingua franca and the teaching of language as a subject. Lingua franca, for me, is part of the discussion of teaching language as a discipline, not as a subject. Now, in the BNCC, they don't discuss this at all. So teachers, when they receive the document of the BNCC, they don't know what to do with it. It's what happened to the orientações curriculares. Many teachers did not receive this. The proposal was a proposal to be discussed. It was the beginning of a process of reflection. The teachers were given this document and told, reproduce it, apply this, turn it into a methodology. No. Curricular proposals are the point of departure, not the point of arrival. And when teachers look at them, they think they have to implement these. We have this problem in Brazil because as you know, maybe you're not aware of this, we have this, in Brazil, we have 3 levels of educational policy: federal level, state level, municipal level, right? Now, policy is produced at the federal level. The federal level will give us the policy that we are obliged to follow. Now, it is the state level and the municipal level that have to implement the policy. Now, the money comes from the federal government for education. Now, whether this money goes to the teachers and the schools will depend on the state level and the municipal level. What is the reality of the country? When it gets to the municipal level, where the teachers are in the classrooms and they're the ones who have to teach, no money. No money available. The money has got lost somewhere along the line. The same thing happens with policy. It is the states who have to educate teachers about the policy to decide on how the policy will be put into practice, be implemented. The policy is philosophical. It's not methodology. The policy doesn't tell teachers what you have to do in your class tomorrow, next week. This is what the states have to do and the municipalities have to do, but they don't. Some states do. Right? That's a problem.
Well, we have another question here from Bianca. Professor Lynn, primeiro eu quero agradecer pelo privilégio de te escutar. Em sua fala, você acaba falando bastante sobre a hierarquia cultural na qual vivemos, que se reflete nas relações do ensino de línguas. Queria saber o que você pensa dessa hierarquia e se os movimentos subversivos a ela são sempre naturais.
Okay, excellent question. Yes, unfortunately, all cultural contexts end up being hierarchical. Some don't, but very, very few. They end up being hierarchical because just the word culture, the way the word culture is used, it's as if it is erudição, right? So culture already implies a hierarchy. Some people have culture, others don't. This is what we imagine, right? Or we refer to people as inculto. What the reality, like language, it's as if some people know language and others don't. Everybody has language. Everybody has culture, but they have different forms of culture. Some of our forms of culture are considered to be good and have value and prestige. Others don't have value and prestige. So today, in our present political situation, we are living in a situation where those forms of culture which have no prestige are given prestige, right? So a disrespect for law, right? A disrespect for gender, a disrespect for differences of sexuality and race, right? So we're living in a current situation where all those forms of culture which were not valued are given prestige by our systems of power at the moment. So we are living in a system of inversion of cultural values. Now, what do we mean by subversion? Subversion is just a challenge to a particular established form of authority, a particular hierarchy. And yes, it's natural to to subvert, it's natural to resist, right? But this doesn't mean that everybody can subvert or can resist. You have to be in a key position to subvert and resist, because part of hierarchy, part of the ideology of a hierarchy, right? And this is what Gramsci, for example, he developed the concept of hegemony for us to understand this. When ideologies are produced, the ideologies are there to tell us, you are capable of thinking, you are not capable of thinking. You are capable of action, you are not capable of action, right? So, as an example, in our current hegemony, if you are a woman, if you are gay or trans, right, and if you are not white, you believe by our current the hierarchy, our hegemony of our current ideology, you believe that you have no voice, you have no power. It's better for you to remain quiet in your little corner and not say anything. So for you to resist, if you are from these categories at present, you have to be very strong. You have to be very revolted, very angry to be able to resist. And fortunately, we do have people who are very strong and very angry. But remember what happened to Marielle, right? What happens to all the people in our, the black poor people in our peripheries, right? They are trying to survive. Their survival is resistance. They're trying to survive in the way that they can. And the police come in and just shoot them, kill them, right? Call them criminals, right? So we lose a dimension of the complexity of this problem. Yeah, so unfortunately, language hierarchies, our cultural hierarchies reproduce our power hierarchies. But we need resistance, we need subversion. It's there, it always, fortunately, we have this human possibility of survival, right? It's not Darwinian because it's not the survival of the fittest. The fittest are those who are trying to silence, put an end to these processes of subversion and survival, or what our black movements call resistencia, right? So contrary to Darwin's notion, I would say it's those who are marginalized who probably have a greater possibility of survival than those who are at the top.
Right. There's a question by Valkyria. Okay, right. Valkyria's question. Besides thinking languages otherwise, what would be possibilities in language teacher education to create opportunities so they can produce productive local alternatives in their language teaching?
This is always possible, but it depends. Here, it will depend on those of us who are involved in teacher education. So I think we have to promote more teachers reflecting on language as a discipline and not language as a subject. What do we do in teacher education? We teach methodology. We teach them to implement a particular textbook or a particular methodology. Very rarely do we teach them to reflect on language as a discipline. This is not impossible. I've done it in my work, right? But it's not what's commonly done, right? And very often teachers don't like it, right? I heard this very often. Você não me ajuda a preparar a minha próxima aula. Amanhã tem que chegar lá e dar uma aula, e você não está ajudando. As if it's this, part of thinking language otherwise is part of what is now being called slow thinking. We need slow thinking. Slow thinking is to step back and reflect on a situation. It's not to be carried away and swallowed by this industrial process, this consumer process of thinking. Tomorrow I have to, in 10 minutes, I have to give a class. Please give me an idea. What can I do? Tomorrow I have to teach. Tell me what to do. No, it's slow thinking is, let me see what I can do, what is possible. Let me take all of these books which are available to me. And instead of just repeating what's in one book or applying one book, what can I learn from these different books? Who are my students? What knowledge do they require? What is going to be useful for them? Do I simply think they're students of English, let me go and teach them English? Let me see, what do they need? How relevant is it? And we can already generalize by saying it's not relevant to our students. In the public school system, it's not relevant for them to learn English as a language. But what is relevant is their education. So what can they learn from learning about English or other foreign languages? If we focus on language education and not learning a foreign language, then we can eliminate all of this, the problems we've had with entre español, sai español, one foreign language, two foreign languages, right? The problem is not learn English or learn French or learn Spanish. You can learn these languages outside the school. What are the educational contributions and benefits of learning a foreign language, whatever foreign language? Not learning to reproduce, to speak, to be proficient in that language, but to learn about foreign languages. Now, perhaps some of you will be shocked by what I'm saying, but I'm suggesting that we think language differently otherwise.
Our colleague, Professor Larissa Mazzucchelli, begins by saying, Lynn, it's always a pleasure to hear you. Teaching diversity and difference through language education is fantastic. Still, I feel English teachers are some of the great gatekeepers, mainly because of ingrained normative colonial higher education training. Can you talk about practices within higher education that tackle it?
Yeah, that's an important question, because it's within higher education that we have the space to either reproduce current ideologies or not. All right. Now, again, like a classroom, just excuse me, I have to let my dog out. I'm also human. I have a body and I have a dog. Okay, so in higher education, this is a space for reflection. Now, there are two places where we can do this in higher education. When within our cursos de letras, right, and within our licenciaturas. So let's begin with our cursos de letras. It all depends on the institution. In your cursos de letras in the institution, what are you expected to do? Are you expected to teach the foreign language as a subject, or are you expected to promote reflection? For example, do you have the possibility of teaching sociolinguistics, language and education, discourse, or do you have to teach English and implement a particular textbook? That is the reality. Implementing a particular textbook or teaching your students English is the reality, let's say, of 90% of our higher education, especially in the private sector. They are there to learn English. You are expected to teach them English, not about English, right? Many of these courses don't even have subjects about linguistics of English. So in these courses, after 4 years, you're expected to come out with a degree which says you are a teacher of English, right? But you probably you haven't even learned enough English to be a teacher. Not only that, because that's not a problem, because you can be a teacher knowing very little English and being able to educate your students a lot about foreign languages. But they haven't even received that kind of support. They probably haven't had subjects which focused on discourse, on language and culture, on sociolinguistics, on variation, diversity, etc., etc. Right? Now we have in the public sector a greater possibility of doing this. Right? So in public universities, many public universities will have subjects in their cursos de letras, which will have these areas that I'm talking about, discourse, sociolinguistics. But we also have to remember that even where we have things like sociolinguistics, discourse, we have to have more moments in these disciplines where a reflection will be promoted on what have you learned from analisi discurso, which will help you as a language teacher. What have you learned from sociolinguistica, which will help you as a language teacher? Unfortunately, very often this doesn't exist. Not because it can't exist, but people make different options, right? So it's not sufficient to just have courses where you can learn to reflect. If reflection is not promoted, it won't occur. But we have a lot of possibilities, yes. So what I'm saying is that it all depends on the body, on the person. It doesn't depend on the institution. Remember the critiques I made about policy. Policies are produced by institutions. They don't really reach practice. So to guarantee practice, reflection as practice, we need people to do this, not institutions. You can have an institution which is extremely patriarchal, extremely homophobic, extremely racist, and you can still do some very progressive work in your classroom. Let me give you an example from personal experience, but somewhere to begin thinking about this. I began my career as in English language teaching, also in the private sector, in networks. I'm not going to name the network, but in a very prestigious network of foreign language teaching, right? Where I was told to go into a classroom. I was given a textbook, and this is what you have to teach on a specific day in a specific class, independent of who your students are. I had groups at the time of old people, and I had groups of teenagers. How could I teach them the same thing without taking into account their differences? This was absurd. The older people were mature people. Many of them already had an experience with foreign languages. The adolescents, most of them were people who were obliged to be there because their parents were paying for it. They particularly had very little interest, because they believed that they could sing a song in English, therefore they knew English. So what I did was I ignored what the institution was obliging me to do, right? If it was Monday, you had to be on page 10. If it was Wednesday, you had to be on page 12 of the textbook, right? And the coordination obliged me, as it obliged all teachers, to fill in a book which said, on this day, I taught this. So what do you think I did? I taught the older people something very different to what I taught the younger people. But if you looked at my report, daily report to the coordination, I did exactly what they told me to do. Right? On Monday, I did page 10. On Wednesday, I did page 12. Now, when they began to suspect, how could Lynn Mário, who doesn't follow rules, be so efficient? Then they began to watch my classes. That's when I left. I couldn't. that was too much, right? But what I'm saying is that there are always spaces for subversion. Subversion is not random. I'm not talking about the subversion, just be different. No, I'm saying subversion follows a particular logic for change, reflection and change. Reflective change, reflected change. It's always possible at different levels, but it requires slow thinking. It's not a question of, let me get a recipe, tell me how to do it, and I'll go there and do it. It takes time.
This is not exactly a question, but it's a comment which Cassia and Vivi Damascena commented on the fact that your speech, although it's focused on English, applies and fits a lot in Portuguese as another language for deaf people. And Cassia goes on to say that she's absolutely amazed because that's exactly what she's been reflecting about lately. The language chosen to be taught doesn't seem to matter sometimes.
That's right. And sometimes, for example, when we think, thank you for the reference to Libras, for example. Sometimes it gets to the point where even Libras, people who teach Libras, can be so colonial, right? So it's not because you're teaching Libras that you are thinking from a different perspective. I have personal experience of discussing Libras, and I work with people who work with deficiency. For example, I do work in my research group. I have people who are working with autists, teaching language to autism, and teaching language to blind people, right? Or teaching language to people who are physically deficient. Now, when the people with Libras, I have had this experience in many cases, some people who use Libras, who are teachers of Libras, come in and say, don't tell us about deficiency. We are against the word deficiency, right? We're not concerned with deficiency. This is very colonial, but just a minute. Libras has succeeded in a lot of conquests, right? Over the years until it was recognized by our constitution, right? But many other forms of deficiency are still not recognized. They're still struggling to be recognized. They don't have a language of their own. Autism, language is simply for autists. These are people who are silent all the time. They don't speak, they don't communicate. Of course they communicate. Of course they understand. We who don't understand how they understand, right? So instead of Libras trying to participate in this discussion of thinking language differently, they come in and say, no, we have a language, we have rights, we are not deficient. Deficiency doesn't describe a situation, a particular situation. Deficiency describes a group, a hegemonic group that rejects difference. And it calls this difference deficiency. So when we discuss deficiency, we are not discussing if you are deficient or not. We are trying to change how the hegemonic group relates to people who are different. But this is a discussion, unfortunately, in my experience, many people in Libras think, no, we don't want to participate in this discussion. It doesn't affect us. We don't see ourselves as deficient. We are past this, right? So we want to discuss, our discussion is based on rights. We have now been recognized legally. We want our rights. But what about the other people who haven't reached the same stage, right? What can you contribute to this? Or it's like saying, for me, it's sad. It's like saying, okay, eu cheguei lá, agora o problema de vocês. Unfortunately, I see this a lot, specifically to people who come from the discussion of Libras. I'm not generalizing. I've been doing work with Libras, for example, in Sweden, where they don't have the same privileges as our people in Libras here. They haven't been recognized yet. So they're still participating with other forms of deficiency to change the hegemonic situation. It's not a question of saying, I'm only concerned with the rights of my group and my people. It's a question of changing the situation for everybody like me.
It's interesting because you have pointed out the need not only to bring the body to the fore, and you mentioned it in passing only, but what was interesting is that we should focus not only on the locus of enunciation of the body, of the producers of theory, but also the people reading them. Maybe right there from the start, so did want to take into account the fact that languages are multiple, the diversity of language, but people who have been reading Saussure wanted to harp on the sameness of language. So it's also up to the body of the readers in the academia, for example, who insist on homogeneity, for example.
That's right. William, that's important. I'd just like to comment on something which, this is the work we used to do, let's say, 40 years ago, and we called it reading, right? And one of the things in my institution at USP, in Letras at USP, we have this giant figure of Antonio Cândido. And here I'm talking about not so much in language as in literature, the teachers of literature. Now, one of the great contributions of Antonio Cândido's thinking towards literature, he said literature is always produced in context, in an ideological, socio-political context. So when Machado is writing, he's writing from a particular ideological context. When Guimarães Rosa is writing, he's writing from a different context. So I can translate this as Antonio Cândido was also pointing to a locus of enunciation of literary writers. Now, Antonio Cândido is used by anybody who works with literature in Portuguese, right? Especially in my institution, he's the name of our library, he's the name of our building, he is the name, right? Now, what is sad is that for the teachers of literature, the teachers of Brazilian literature or Portuguese literature or literatures in Portuguese, they don't interpret the same theory of Antonio Cândido to a pedagogical perspective. So if the writer if the writer is always writing from a certain ideological, social, historical context, the reader is also reading from a ideological, social, historical context. So stop teaching literature as if the meaning is in the text. Even when you are teaching your student that Machado is writing from this context, and we will teach our students about the historical context from which Machado is writing, but also remember your students are reading Machado from a different historical context. And therefore there will be conflicts in reading, there will be difficulties in reading, because the context of production of the text is different to the context of the reading of the text. They are both contexts of production. The writer's context of production produces the text that you are reading. But when we are reading a text, we are also producing another text, our interpretation of that text, right? So when we have differences of context between the reading and the writing of the text, we will have difficulties of understanding, a bit like lingua franca. So then we need negotiation. And this is the pedagogical problem of teaching literature, right? How to understand. It's not to learn about the greatness of the literary text. we're fed up with that. We've had enough of that. Right? When we're teaching literatures, how can we teach our students to appreciate a literary text? And just by telling them how great Shakespeare was is not going to solve the problem if they can't read Shakespeare. It's to tell them how their reading, to explain to them about their reading of Shakespeare also comes from a context. And so their difficulty is not because Shakespeare was difficult. He wasn't. Shakespeare wasn't even writing most of the time. The writing of Shakespeare's text was done by other people. Shakespeare produced text for his actors. And the people who watched Shakespeare's plays were the pauvres, right? So when the pauvres reads Shakespeare, they think, oh, it's so difficult because Shakespeare was erudito. No. Right? Now, so we have to understand that we always read from a context. And like I tell my students, William may remember this, he was my postgraduate student, don't tell me that a text is difficult. Tell me how the difficulty that you find in a text is related to where you are reading the text from. Right? So the text academic texts were not written for us. So obviously they will be difficult. Right? Now, what do we have to know to be able to understand an academic text? We have to bring our knowledge that exists in our context to help us understand a text. So understanding a text is as active as writing or producing a text. They're both forms of what Derrida called écriture, right, or writing. So we are authors of our readings of texts, whether they're academic, journalistic, or literary.
Lynn, I can't thank you enough. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, like music to my ears. And I think you always, I've been listening to you for over 20 years. And perhaps it's always new, maybe because my body's getting older too, right? But I'm eager to listen to you again, and perhaps next time you can talk to us about decolonial education as abraçar o quilombo. Which is a new perspective on your thinking language otherwise move. So perhaps Cristiane, Simone, and I can invite you to our next decoloniality in language teaching. And I hope everyone who's listening had the same opinions and it contributed to their researches as well. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Cristiane.
Thank you, Professor Lynn, for this always enlightening talk. And I'm sure you're going to have lots of things to rethink. Listening to Lynn always provoke us to think otherwise. And you saw that how William is smart, because he's already inviting you in a live transmission. So there's no place to say no. But thank you very much.
It'll be a pleasure. Yeah. Okay. Now, what's important is, I didn't make references to particular decolonial theorists, but that's how we read theory. We read the theory, and then we have to make connections with our own contexts, with our own situations. Otherwise, who cares what the theorists are saying if we can't learn from them? Right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody who's been watching us, and for those who's going to watch us later. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Bye.